All right, let's give it, maybe another minute or two, and then Ellie, you can set us up.
Supposing I forgot to send a friend. Oh, wait.
All right, let's start. Let's go for it. I'm starting, so anyone who joins us won't be missing anything important. I mean, I'm important, but not like the four of you. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Kim Bissell, one of the owners at Broadway Books. It's been over a year since we posted an event in the store, and while we miss seeing all of your wonderful faces in person, we still feel very proud to continue to be able to offer, albeit virtually, such a wonderful lineup of writers and humans in discussion about their art, and tonight is one of those nights. Before we get to the main event, I want to share some information about a couple of our June virtual events. 2 weeks from tonight, on June 7th at 5 p.m. Pacific time, we present Persistence: What It Takes to Publish a Book, featuring Ellen Michelson, Joanna Rose, and Susie Vitello. Many of you know these three powerhouse writers and teachers, and we're thrilled that they're willing to share their experiences with the trials and tribulations of publishing today. On Wednesday, June 16th, 6 p.m. Pacific time, we are thrilled to welcome Richard Brown, reading and discussing his new book, This Is Not For You: An Activist Journey of Resistance and Resilience. A Black Panther activist and photographer, Mr. Brown is one of Portland's most interesting people. He has spent his life working to bridge the divide between Portland's Black community and the police. He'll be sharing some of his stories, hopefully a few photographs, in conversation with his co-author, Brian Benson, and young activist Eloise Doubleday. Not an event to miss. Again, June 16th, Wednesday at 6 p.m. You can find the links to register for both of these events, as well as book recommendations, general store info, and our 24-hour day book ordering platform at our website, www.broadwaybooks.net. A few housekeeping items for tonight. Be sure to keep an eye on the chat for links to purchase and support any of the writers, as well as our fiercely independent bookstore. If you have questions for Alex or any of the speakers tonight, feel free to enter them in the chat, or you can use the Q&A function. We will be checking both. And now for the main event. According to Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah, the New York Times bestselling author of Friday Black, The Atmospherians is what happens when an amazing idea meets stunning awareness, meets brilliant writing, a book dazzling with power. We are lucky indeed to have Alex here with us tonight discussing their new book, The Atmospherians. Alex McElroy is a non-binary writer based in Brooklyn. Their writing appears in Vulture, BuzzFeed, The Atlantic, The Cut, Esquire, Tin House, and has been supported by the Bread Loaf Writers Conference, the Tin House Summer Workshop, and the Sewanee Writers Conference, and the Elizabeth George Foundation. The Atmospherians is their first novel. Joining Alex in discussion tonight is a triumvirate of Portland super talents. Kimberly King Parsons grew up in Texas. Her debut collection of stories, Blacklight, was a finalist for the Oregon Book Award and the Edmund White Award, and was longlisted for both the National Book Award and the Story Prize. Originally from Alabama, Genevieve Hudson is the author of the story collection Pretend We Live Here. Their debut novel, Boys of Alabama, was a finalist for an Oregon Book Award. Chelsea Bieker is from California's Central Valley. Her debut novel, Godshot, was also a finalist for an Oregon Book Award and was longlisted for the Center of Fiction's First Novel Prize. What a gift for us to see you all here together. Thank you. And with that, let's start the show.
Well, thank you so much, Kim and Sally and Ellie and Kim and Jen and Chelsea, for being here. I'm going to read for about 10 minutes. It is great to be virtually in Portland. I spent 5 months in Portland, a brief sort of Portland sojourn, and I went to college in Oregon as well. So it's really an honor to read with Broadway. So thank you all for having me. So I'll read for about 10 minutes, and then we will do a Q&A, both between me and the other readers, and then with the audience as well. Okay, so I don't think you need to know much to get into this chapter. Pretty much just that Sasha, who is the narrator, has just had a fight with her former business partner, Cassandra, over the phone, and that like continues to sting in her mind. So she is feeling fairly uh, resentful and fairly hurt by that still, which changes how she acts in a lot of ways. Okay. I offered to pick up the men's uniforms. To save you the trouble, I told Dyson. In truth, my call with Cassandra had left me feeling embarrassed and bitter, and I thought a drive might clear my head. Dyson was reluctant to hand over the keys. I fed him a line he told me back at the mall. This won't work if we don't trust each other, I said. I hate when you use me against me, he said, but he needed the extra time. He had to chat with the men to finalize their travel arrangements, and there was still work to do on the doctrine, a set of guidelines for the men who would soon arrive. Make sure you check the designs on the uniforms, he told me. These people weren't my first choice. Cooped up in my apartment over the last few months, I'd become sheepish and brittle. I'd become a person I pitied, but the drive unlocked something ferocious in me. On the back roads, I sprayed waves of gravel and nearly vaulted the car into every ditch that I passed. What a dumb and dangerous thing, the car. What a joy to assume power over something so deadly, so heavy, so fun. Driving is an act of accepting you have no control. The car might skid on a splinter of ice and swivel you into a tree. The car might need a few stitches, a bumper, a buff on the hood, but that's the end of you. Blam, splat, an X over each eye, tongue slumming out of your mouth. I'd forgotten the pure, powerless pleasure of sitting behind a steering wheel, turning and twisting and revving and braking as if it made any difference. I skimmed the edge of death a half dozen times before I even reached the highway. Apparently, California is home of the highway, the kind of highway that frees the mind and the soul, but it could never unleash me like a New Jersey highway. 80 and 287 and 1, the original, were not merely roads in my life, but escape routes from the bramble of stop signs and tractor crossings and dirt paths gluing my hometown together. I zipped onto the highway, liquored with giddiness, gunning Dyson's hatchback until the steering wheel trembled. I passed everyone and blasted a pop radio station, sang along to a song I'd never heard in my life. The sky was a blank blue sheet, the sun devoured by distance. I could have gone anywhere. Every exit offered a new life, lives that would surely be easier than whatever awaited me back at the atmosphere. But I was angry at Cassandra for her cheerful condescension, and I wanted to make the atmosphere work, to prove to her that I didn't deserve her pity. Dyson ordered uniforms from a mom and pop printing shop called Hertz Shirts. The store shared an aging strip mall containing a bodega, a laundromat, an abandoned sub shop, and 3 CrossFit studios. Bulky men in tank tops were flipping tractor tires in the parking lot. Hertz Shirts smelled of spearmint candies and ink. Enormous machines like titanium buffaloes grazed behind the counter. A desktop computer grumbled next to the register. Welcome, said Mom and Pop, a pair of wizened white people who had aged into identical twins. They wore gray slacks and blue button-down shirts spotted with fingerprints. I'm picking up an order for Dyson Lane, I said. The thrill of driving thundered inside me. My words shook with impatience. I wanted back on the road. Pop retrieved a pair of plastic-wrapped bundles from the back. I need to check them, I said. What's to check? Asked Mom. Please open the package, I said, then snapped my fingers when they stalled. We stand by our work, she said. Pop pulled a box cutter out of his back pocket and buried the blade into the wrapping. He cut cleanly through the center without speaking. Inside the first bundle were tracksuits, t-shirts, and mesh shorts for the men. The tracksuits and t-shirts were stone-colored, the mesh shorts as red as strawberries. The Atmospherians was stitched into the breast of the shirts. The second bundle held t-shirts, zip hoodies, and shorts for Dyson and me. Our color scheme inverted the men's. Silver bottoms, red tops. Our names were stitched beneath the Atmospherians. Spelled correctly, but a bothersome flourish had been added to the final A in Sasha. Mom asked if I was satisfied. The flourish was a meaningless mistake. Any other day, I would have thanked Mom and politely left. But I was still angry about my call with Cassandra. My life seemed petty and small compared to hers, and I wanted to exert power over someone, to feel how I imagined Cassandra must have felt talking to me. There's a problem with the A in Sasha, I said. That's traditional script, said Mom. It must look unfamiliar to someone your age. The tale is excessive, I said. It's whimsical, unscrupulous. I can't accept it in this condition. Perfect condition? Mom snapped. I have a reputation to uphold, I said, though I certainly didn't. So you don't want the clothing? Mom asked. No, I don't want it, I said, but I need it today. You've backed me into a corner. I hope you're proud of yourselves, I said. I handed over Dyson's credit card. Mom examined the card. If I had been more polite, I doubt she would have studied it so exhaustively. But she controlled the room now and gave the card to Pop for approval. Disapproval. Your name is Sasha, she said. That's right. Pop fanned his face with the credit card. This card isn't Sasha's, said Mom. Dyson gave me his card to pick up the order. Identity theft is on the rise, Mom said. Pop spoke his first words. I was telling Mom the other day about identity thieves who behead their victims and feed their bodies to carnivorous pigs and escape with their cash and their credit cards and their clothes and run to places like Cuba and Sudan before anyone's wiser. This is my partner's card, I said. We used to say husband, Pop said, still fanning his face. Business partner. We run a small business. We use Dyson's card for expenses. How about you show some ID? Mom said. It's Dyson's card. He made the order. You stitched his name onto a dozen shirts. Correctly, I might add, without a whimsical flourish. My best and worst selves always veered close together. Obsessive, critical, stubborn. And the resistance only made me more reckless and stubborn. You're sure protesting a lot, Mom said. If I were an identity thief, wouldn't I buy a TV or fancy shoes? I can't pretend to imagine the logic of thieves, Mom said. The problem with identity thieves is police never know who to track. Maybe Sasha is Dyson's wife, Mom said to Pop. Maybe Sasha and Dyson are stuffed in her trunk, he replied. I'm Sasha, I shouted. Then let us see your ID. All chopped and zipped into baggies, Pop said. You'll run the card if I show you my license? They nodded in unison. Reluctantly, I handed it over. Pop spelled my name aloud. Sashamarcus. Mom typed it into Google and gasped at the results. I spread both hands over the monitor. That's all lies, I said. Get back, said Pop. He clutched a small can of mace but seemed ill fit to use it, his arm trembling, barely aiming it in my direction. I stepped back with my hands held high. It says you killed a man. Mom leaned close to the screen. A pastor, a father of 3. It's an exaggeration, I said. Clickbait. Do you even know what that is? I sensed something evil about you, said Pop. I'm calling the cops, said Mom. I slapped the phone out of her hands. Pop didn't point the mace at me, but geysered it up into the air. Through coughing and tears, I swept Dyson's credit card and the clothing into my arms, raced it to the car. They followed as far as the sidewalk. Thief, they shouted. Muscled crossfitters in tank tops and form-fitting sweatpants darted across the parking lot. I pulled onto the road before they could reach me, but they gave chase down the sidewalk and caught up at the first red light. They spread out along the driver's side and squatted, gripped the frame of the car. 1, said the men. 2, the cross street's light ascended to yellow, to red. I gassed the engine at 3. Behind me, the men shook the hurt out of their hands. I'll stop there. Great. Thank you. Thank you.
I'll help us transition into the conversational part of the evening. Alex, thank you so much for reading that. I loved hearing you read from this book out loud, and I think you picked a great section too. I know there's a lot to talk about when it comes to kind of all of the varying themes that are so present in this novel. And, you and I, we were able to have a conversation that is up on Bomb, if anybody wants to read it, that like kind of went into more depth with a lot of, like a lot of the different things that your book touches on. But one thing that I was really kind of still thinking about after our conversation is this idea of the internet novel.
Yeah.
What it means to kind of like write in a tradition of the internet novel. And we talked about this a little bit. Your book obviously is so is like very immersed in the culture of social media and like what that does to people's lives, to community, to our selfhood. And as writers, we are contending with the internet as this pervasive form of modern life. And I wonder as a writer sometimes, like, how much do I bring the internet into my text, because it's such a part of my lived experience. And I've just been seeing a lot come up lately of like internet novel lists. And we talked about a Substack that Brandon Taylor published about internet novels. So I guess the long way around to get to my question is, do you think of the Atmospherians as being in the tradition of this internet novel? And, if so, or if not, like, what does that mean to you as a writer and also as a reader?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I mean, it's weird because my answer has probably changed since we spoke for that Bomb interview. And something that I've been thinking about a lot in relationship to like this being an internet novel is like, for a while I was like, no, like this is not an internet novel. Like I don't think that much of the book takes place online in the same way that I think like a book like Oilers or Lockwoods, they both take a lot more time online versus mine. But I do think that my book deals maybe with like the repercussions of having been online. Like, I guess, what does it mean to have been like ousted from the internet, or how like even when you're not on it, how does it sort of continue to sort of shape your life and shape your thinking, I think is what I was really interested in. I think Euler's book does that as well really nicely, to sort of have, especially in the question of like performance. But I think mine is mostly like what happens to the ways that people think about what they want to contribute to the world. For these characters, it's really shaped by the relationship to the internet. For Sasha, she sort of creates a self through the internet, and upon losing it, she really wants to regain that, and is looking for a way to regain that almost sort of follows the same logic of the internet. Dyson's understanding of how they're going to be good people, how they're going to sort of fix the world, follows in that same sort of mindset of we can just, fix the people who are causing harm and eventually like sort of be the heroes. So Dyson is very much looking for a quick and easy solution. And I think the internet is a great place for quick and easy solutions, in that it just sort of it like brings 2 a.m. infomercials to us at all hours. So now we no longer need to like, wait for that. It can just sort of be there immediately, like in our Instagram feed. So I was just really, I think, interested just what it means when you're constantly thinking like that, and how that style of thinking follows you outside of the screen. And Dyson, I think, is someone who's severely been like clearly been like infected by that style of thought, because I think it drives so much of what he thinks of as like morality, or like what he thinks of as what it means to do good in the world, is shaped by internet language and thought.
I just want to ask one follow-up to
Yeah,
that.
please.
I'll open it up. But
Yeah.
and we talked about this a little bit in our conversation as well. But when you're saying, it's less about like a book actually taking place online, but more about like, how does the internet imprint on us? How does that infect or move our thought patterns and our like relational patterning and all these things? So I'm curious, like you as a writer, like being online and having a practice that involves the internet, like how does that affect your work? In what ways do you think that that's like patterned your own thoughts or affected the way that you show up on the page of the stories you're telling?
Yeah, I think it absolutely has. And I think it definitely has. Like, I can feel when my characters when they seem pretty flat, right? And flat and not in the sort of like way of like an old, like, 1960s, like Iowa Writers Workshop craft book or something like that. But I mean, like flat in that, like, they just seem like like they're who they are and how they are presenting seems very much like contained to the box of like 140 characters. And when I feel as if people are thinking in 140 characters, like I definitely know that my like, I guess there's just like a snappiness to like a tweet or being on, like, I'm mostly on Twitter. I'm not really on Instagram that much. So like once my language starts to adopt that kind of snappiness, I feel like I need to begin to back off a little bit because I can feel that it's like infecting me. It also, I think what is really is like I'm writing now in a way, and like I'm sure that all of you have felt this as well, and people have like warned me about of like there's a real difference from when you're like writing for no one and then suddenly writing like for an audience. And I think the internet has also made me aware of that, and like now suddenly there are strangers who can be reading my book, so there's a different way in which I'm relating to the page versus how I might have been sort of previously. Yeah. Can you hear that honking? That's happening outside. Okay, yeah.
That's Zoom live.
Yeah, that's Brooklyn. They're very excited for this reading. They're sad they can't be here. Yeah.
I think my question could kind of go next because it's sort of, since you're not trying to write, this isn't a book that's like in tweets or you're not trying to limit yourself. One of the things I find so compelling about the Atmospherians is this sort of like energy and exuberance in the sentences. And I think one of the ways that you do that, I mean, you do it in a lot of ways, but one of the ways is through lists. And you're so good at them and I love them. And I just want to read like a couple of little excerpts from my favorite lists. Okay, let's see. I'm going to skip around in this one, but this is Sasha talking about, in an effort to remake my image and to pay rent, I had applied for jobs at a number of charities. The ASPCA, the Organization for African Children, Save the Peruvian Mice, then it goes on, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, Make a Wish, Have a Heart, Break a Leg, Give a Lung, Teach for America, Cats in the Schools, which is where I lost it, and then LAMB, or LAM. Then there's another one later, we wish we had money to go see the new show in the city, the one reviewed in the Times. We considered taking up smoking. We considered snorting cocaine. We watched films in translation and argued over what they meant and agreed they didn't mean anything. That was the point. We longed for ennui and weariness, but what we felt was a deep, gullible passion for anywhere else, splashing inside us like a puppy in a pool. That repetition and the list of we considered. And then this one is another favorite. Sasha talking about her harassment online. A carnival of notifications flashed on my phone. Photos of American flag painted Uzis and half erect cocks and fully erect cocks, and my body teetering from the loop of a noose made from an American flag, and my face painted like a clown, and my face inside a large bowl of blood, and messages reading, you suck and die and fuck yourself with a fire. And it's just, there's such energy to that list. And I wondered, I personally just adore reading and writing lists, but I wondered how you feel the lists function for you in this book.
Yeah, I mean, lists are really important for me, so I'm glad that they stood out. I mean, lists are I feel like one of the first like sort of readers of this book was talking to me about lists, and so it's good to sort of return to that. I think lists are really great ways to sort of get humor onto the page, and I think a lot of writers who we think of as like funny writers, if we look back at them, like they use a lot of lists. Like I'm thinking of like Donald Barthelme for one example, and The Dead Father was a huge part of sort of, especially for the final draft of this book. I returned to that novel a few times, just to look at the ways in which he created variety inside of a very closed system, which was really important for this book. And I think lists are a way to do that. And lists also offer a word that's been coming up a lot is texture. And they sort of get us outside of the sort of traditional narrative, sort of the kind of development of like, traditional chapter arc. And a list is a way to really break that up and to sort of get backstory in there, to get sort of a different sort of like different shapes of desire as well, which I think is coming up in the one that you read, which is following Sasha and Dyson when they're teenagers. So all of that is creating a lot of variation sort of into it. And lists are also really fun for me because they create surprise in what, and that I think is like my really sort of favorite part of a list. And I know, Jen, that very same sort of list of different charities came up for our bomb interview. And I think that was a site for me where what's really fun for lists about me is probably something that like speaks to what is really fun for writing about me at large, which is that there's a sense of reality mixed in with a really sort of not fantastical, but I think like just absurdity, right? Like exaggeration or absurdity. And I think lists are a very distilled version of that entire thing, which I can have sort of the reality of like the Red Cross or the ASPCA mixing with something like LAMB or Cats in the Schools. So like, and I think having those things next to each other, we can even say like, I mean, something came up when I talked to Kira Madden the other night, like this, like sort of the notion of defamiliarization. And I think that in a list like that, by having the real next to the exaggerated, they sort of defamiliarize each other. And, or like, you know, the exaggerated defamiliarizes the real and the real familiarizes the exaggerated.
I love that. Well, this kind of, you touched on this a little bit, but my next question, which kind of flows from that,
Yeah.
is about humor and the function of humor in your fiction. And I know that you, just knowing you personally, you are a really funny person and someone who looks for humor. I wondered how do you think that it works in this book that is about a lot of really heavy stuff, frankly. And I just wondered, how did you feel yourself sort of injecting the humor in later, or was it always there in the voice from the beginning?
Yeah, it's definitely something that came up later. It's also that like I find a lot of things funny that maybe other people don't. And so like there are probably parts of this book that I find really funny for a while that other people are like, that's not funny. You know, and sort of, and I was just like laughing at my own jokes. But I think tonally, I think the humor is absolutely necessary in this book because as you say, there are some like fairly grim topics that come up in this. And I think one of the only ways to allow for those topics to exist and to not be like extremely just sort of like weighing down the entire novel is to think about sort of how humor can sort of interrupt the heaviness of the book. And it can interrupt, and I think it can also, like it's creating levity, but it's just sort of adding, again, like adding variation, and to sort of have a book that is able to broach topics that might be serious from a sort of more humorous tone was really interesting to me. And I think a lot of books that I really love do that. And they sort of use humor not really as like a Trojan horse. I mean, there's that version which like, you know, it's a way to sort of get people to want to read your book. But I also think that humor is a way for me to say something true that I normally can't say like straight faced. Like I have a really hard time like I don't want this to become therapy, but like a hard time like saying exactly what I mean. But I think humor is like a great way to like say what I mean without having to say what I mean. And I think the humor in this book allows for me to make a sort of commentary that I wouldn't be able to make if I were trying to write like a serious realist novel. That's also not the person I am, which is also something that was really important over the course of writing this book, is like needing to realize that like I can't write the novel I can't write, which is such a like you know, obvious tautology, but I think it takes a while to figure that out. Is that like I was trying to write a very different novel from what I could actually write for like too long. And then eventually I just had to accept like, no, this is how I think, and this is how like I can think in my world. Yeah.
I love that, Alex. It
Thank
was
you.
so wonderful to read your book and
Thank
to
you.
hear you talk about humor too, because I found this book to be, I mean, I was howling laughing. I was reading lines out loud. And I think for me, a lot of the humor comes from such attention and such specificity to the world that the book is taking place in.
Yeah.
And often it's in those very specific details that I think it just tickles like that funny bone for me. And it, like you're saying, it's like not what most people might find funny, but it triggers like that almost uncomfortable feeling that elicits laughter. So I was doing a lot of that in your book.
Thank you.
And I was so impressed how you throughout created these, not really micro, but these separate worlds. You know, we have Dam, we have the atmosphere, we have, you know, Dyson's childhood home. That, you know, that whole section was one of my favorite parts of the book, actually. Just being in that house and seeing that family system operate. And so selfishly, I would love to hear you talk about creating the character of Dyson and, you know, where that started in the process of writing this book. Was he really always there for you? And then how did you decide Dyson would run this cult? I guess that's many questions in one, but that's what's on my mind.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's like I wish I had a easy answer for that. And I'm sure that all of you know with your writing, like where do characters come from is like, I feel like we know more about like the origin of the universe than we know about like where like an actual character comes from. Maybe we actually do know a lot about the origin of the universe and I'm just like, don't know anything about space. But like Dyson is just like this weird, like, it's like I feel like every character is like a Mr. Potato Head, like with like found bits like that you just sort of make from like whatever you find like in your backyard or like on the street. And so like there are parts of him that are me, there are parts of him that are friends of mine, there are parts of him that are like strangers whom I've never met, people I've passed in the street, you know, childhood friends, childhood bullies, you know, all of them like, you know, sort of come together to create this sort of amalgam of a person. And I think what I was really interested in with a character like Dyson is a kind of like ambition without um, like adequacy. Like he seems like someone who is, one of the jokes that I would make is in like the early stages of this book, once I realized sort of like what the idea was, that like it was like Bad News Bears meets Jonestown. And that like it was a like very clearly these people were bad at what they were trying to do and like total like lovable losers. And had no idea how to, you know, start a cult like this. And that's sort of like who Dyson is. And Dyson is someone who is talented in all the ways that he wishes he weren't. And that I think is like the constant struggle for him. Like when he's an actor, he's someone who is like really good at sort of performing when he doesn't have to have any lines. And that is something that like really frustrates him because he would rather like have lines and have like something of a career. And even though he could like settle for that kind of mediocrity, for that sort of place in the background, it's something that sort of deeply disturbs him. And so he creates a world where he can be at the center of this. And sort of what that eventually shows him is that he is not prepared for that. He is not cut out for that. And he has to face continually again and again what his shortcomings are. As for what I was inspired by, I mean, one, I wrote recently, last week for Vulture, I wrote a piece about sort of cult documentaries and cult movies and cult books. And one of the ones that came up that I did think about a lot is Holy Hell, which is about this cult called the Buddha Field. And the person who led that was a former actor who would demand that, I think he made all of his followers build him a playhouse. And like annually they would have this play in which he would be like at the very center of it. And like, obviously he would be the star of it. And what's so like, I mean, he also committed like a series of like terrible abuses. But there was just something so like pitiable about this like need to like, he couldn't find a way to be respected in a career that he admired. So this person needed to find extremely vulnerable people in order to give him the attention that he desired. and something about that was really fascinating for me for Dyson's like, and how I can begin to do two things, right? Like think about what would lead someone to be in that position, especially now, in a sort of like millennial attention economy. So that was driving a lot of Dyson, was driving a lot of like Dyson's childhood home, like, you know, what sort of like anger and also like desire for hope that you find in the character like Dyson's mother. So that shaped a lot of Dyson for me. And I think overall, I was just really looking for um, what happens when someone becomes so desperate for attention that they believe that they deserve. Like, what lengths are they willing to go to in order to get that attention? And that I think Dyson is sort of a cautionary tale about that. I mean, I talked to The Believer about that in an interview with Alexander Lumens, and he brought up the term cautionary tale, which I think I hadn't thought about before, but I like a lot. And I think that Dyson definitely serves as that throughout the book.
I love that. Thank you for talking about that character. I know that we are saving a portion of our time for audience questions. So if you have a question, you can drop it in our Q&A box or in the chat, and all of us are kind of keeping our eye out there for those. I'm not seeing any yet, so hit us with your burning desires. But yeah, until then, I'm wondering, when my book came out, it was immediately classified as a cult book. And I think in the beginning of writing it, I didn't think of it like that at all. But the cult was something that sort of, it grew and expanded and formed through the drafts. And it almost, I look back at it now and I see it almost as this nice sort of craft device to contain the world that I wanted to manage. Like I could really orchestrate it in this specific way.
Yeah.
And it becomes this like claustrophobic container for the craft of the book. And I'm wondering if your intention with the cult was at the outset of writing the book, or is that something, do you consider this a cult book, whatever that means? Or, what was that like for you?
Yeah, I thought so much about this, about like what sort of makes a cult book, and what it even means to write a cult book. I mean, when I was in grad school, I wrote, part of my dissertation was about like the idea of the cult novel and like what it means to like write a cult novel. In books like your book, Alexander Kleeman's book, R.L. Kwan's The Incendiaries, Ling Ma's Severance, like The Girls, like all these sort of cult books. What I was really fascinated in is they tend to follow a traditional, or the shape of what we think of as the cult novel. And even like before those recent examples, there were things like, what is the one that like Nick Cage did a remake of? The Wicker Man, yeah. And like sort of normally there's like a outsider that comes into a mysterious land, and the goal is to sort of like understand what this is all about. And I think that for me was the traditional scope of the cult novel. And I was curious about that, but I also wondered like how I could begin to invert that, like how I could sort of play with those tropes in a way that would also speak to what seemed to be like a very I would say like sort of internet language of like, we need to like do something different, right? Like we need to like, I'm imagining someone like, instead of like, we need to like disrupt the metro system, like we need to disrupt cults, right? And their idea, and I think what's so funny about every time there's like something like disrupting, it's never about really making it better. It's about making it more profitable. And it's about sort of highlighting or allowing for one person to really get ahead. And I think that that's really the mindset that's driving Dyson on this. He's essentially saying something like, how can we disrupt masculinity, and how can we like disrupt cults and like sort of hack this and get to the easy way? Because he eventually sort of comes along and says that like, cults are good things. Cults are ways that we can sort of fix these men, which is also something I've talked about this as well elsewhere, maybe not in live interviews, but something that I've thought a lot about is the sort of like the bad apple theory, which comes up both, especially when we think about like violent policing, and also with things like corporations, in which we think like, that it's always like one bad cop, for example, and that if we like eliminate like that person, then like the police force will be completely okay. Or like with corporations, like it's one bad CEO, and as long as we sort of replace that person with someone who's more progressive, then the structure itself can be sort of fixed from the top down. And I was really curious about how that language could be applied to something that we, I think, socially, universally, I won't say despise, but distrust, at the very least. And so I was curious about what would happen if Dyson used that language to talk about something like a cult, in which everyone can be like, no, cults are bad. And so if that logic would continue to hold water and to sort of like render those ideas fairly absurd by showing how they are, how they eventually just sort of like protect a system doesn't really have anyone's best interests at heart. I feel like I veered around the actual cult question. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I loved that. I loved it. Okay, we have some audience questions, and I will read one. I'd love to hear about satire in this piece. Humor was talked about, obviously, but satire is so specific. And in this book, it can be everyone and no one. And I found that fascinating, also because everyone is sympathetic as well.
Yeah. So satire is when sort of writing, like the satire that interests me most is the satire that seems sort of fearless. Like I get really annoyed when I'm like told like a book is satirical and I read it and it's just like, isn't Trump bad? And it's like, this isn't like like I knew this already to be the case. And I guess I'm really interested in the place where like satire meets complicity. And that I think was really important to me. And I think goes back to the question that was just asked, is like how satire functions, in which it is a critique of like everyone at the same time, and also it can potentially be a critique of like no one, right? And when it's a critique of no one, I think oftentimes it is a critique of like the speaker. But I think it's important that satire understands the ways in which it's not just about, I mean, there are like two things. One, I think there's like satire is best for me when it is like punching up versus like punching down, or when it is like what I think of as like when it's not like making the first joke that comes to mind. And I oftentimes, like when I write, I'll be like, oh, that's really funny, and then I realize like, oh, it's the first joke that came to mind, and there's probably like something better that I can do. There's something like sort of a little bit stronger that I can think about. So I think a lot of like bad satire in my mind feels very much like first joke type of stuff. So I really didn't want to do that a lot of times in this book. Also, I just wanted to think about how can satire actually be used as a way to like speak truth to power, which I think is the point of it, right? And to show, I guess you could say like to show that like the emperor has no clothes, right? Like how is satire a way to sort of expose power for being fairly vulnerable and scared, I think, in a lot of ways. And that was my goal for a lot of this, right? Is to show how the people who I think who appear most powerful, people like Cassandra, people like Blake Days, people like Dyson are always extremely vulnerable and like extremely scared of losing whatever power they have. And I think whenever I like sort of poke fun at them or sort of create jokes about them, it's highlighting the ways in which they're extremely vulnerable and fear losing whatever status they have. And I think that sort of acknowledging the humor in how small their little like floating iceberg of power is where sort of a lot of humor can come from.
I can relay a question for you.
Cool.
Let's see here. Oh, just a question about the cover of your book. Sort of what went into that process. And Chelsea and Jen and I were talking about whenever we got our mock-ups or our choices, we were like texting each other to be like, what do you think? And what's going on with this? And like asking opinions. And it's such a like nerve-wracking and really exciting time. And it would be cool to hear how the process for the cover of Atmosphereans came about.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit about this before the show went on, but so I for years was like, I am a like capital V, very chill author. Like I do not need to sort of say anything about my cover. I will accept whatever I receive. And then one day last summer, I received an email from my editor who was like, we're going to meet with the design team. Do you have any ideas for covers? And I just sort of like, if I had a desk, I would have slid everything off of it to like immediately like, you know, clear my schedule. And I just spent like the entire day just like finding like cover comps that I thought would sort of work well with my cover. They asked if there were any excerpts, and I came up with like a list of like 30 pages of excerpts from like ranked from like what I thought would be like best. And I think, and then I sent like the most like batty email of all time explaining what my like rationale was for the covers that I wanted to see, in which I was like, maybe an Instagram story was like one of them. And the designer Leiwan Kwan did an amazing job. She came back with 2 covers. And I think between the 2 of them, this one just seemed the better fit for the type of book that I wanted to write. And I think that both of them were like right, and both of them were born out of ideas that I had. But I think this one sort of had the sense of I think what's really important about this book are the drips, which can seem like a really sort of small detail, but I think what that does is show a sense of like interaction between the real world and the sort of screen world of this Instagram-y style cover. And so I really admire the ways in which Lei Wong Kwan did that for the cover. And it's something that like I was like extremely annoying about, like over the course of like 3 different cover mock-ups. Kwan was giving me like different drip mock-ups for it before we like came up with like the final one for this, which I think is absolutely superb. So I'm really grateful that they listened to me and weren't just like, your cover is your cover, and just gave me like a blank blue cover or something like that, like a they gave me the Fitzcarraldo treatment. They actually let me choose my cover, so which was great.
I sometimes wonder when you see just like a blank, like a yellow cover with just text, you're like, oh man, did something happen? Like what happened to that, you know?
Yeah, exactly. That person asked for too much. That the little Icarus that they were. Yeah. So yeah.
I know that we're kind of closing in on time here, but I saw in the chat another question pop up that seemed kind of like a good way to tie it all together. Sally asked if you were working on another book, and that was like the first part of the question Kim asked. But so what you working on, Alex?
I will only answer if the rest of you answer. This is like a blood pact between authors. So Kim has actually read some of my next book. So I am working on a book that I like to think of as magical autofiction, and I would say it's like Rachel Cusk meets Freaky Friday. So it is about a newlywed couple who moves to Eastern Europe and who wake up one morning and have switched bodies, but one of them has gone missing. So and then that's my sales pitch so far. Yeah.
And it's accurate, and it's also it's so beautiful. I'm so excited for more. Like our writing group is sort of fallen off, and I can't wait for us to pick up again so we can see more and more and more.
Thank you.
I just turned in a novel called The Boiling River to my editor at Knopf, and
Ooh, yeah.
And we have some plans to do. I'm going to Yaddo for 3 weeks in July, so I'm going to get revisions done when I'm there. It's been so hard, like this year, I'm sure for everyone, this year's been so hard. My child keeps coming in the room and just standing silently in the corner while we're talking, which is awesome. But it's been so hard to write with kids. I can't wait to just get some space and be away so I can wrap up these revisions. And so that's what's next for me. Chelsea, go.
Yeah, I'm also working on another novel. Like Kim, it's been pretty hard to get that focused time. But I have a draft. It's about motherhood and all of the ailments of motherhood and the body that nobody wants to talk about and maybe nobody wants to read about, but that's what I'm writing. So, you know, it's that. I'll just say that. But I really am enjoying writing it. So, yeah.
I'm also working on a new novel right now. It's definitely in the early stages, but what I can say about it is that it's a kind of centers around someone returning to the place they went to college for their ex-girlfriend's wedding, and they're kind of returning to this place where they changed so much, but they're coming back in a body that feels very different because they become very queer, they're non-binary, and sort of facing these aspects of your past with your future, what you've wanted for your life versus where you are, kind of looking at some of those bigger themes.
Awesome.
Well, I think, Jen, you're absolutely right that was the perfect question to just sort of tie it all together. And that was like a super bonus on an already fabulous evening to get to hear what all 4 of you are working on. So thank you for sharing that with us. And thank you all for joining us tonight. And a special thanks to Alex and Chelsea and Jen and Kim. I encourage the audience to go to the events page where you can purchase books from all 4 of these authors, and the link is in the chat box. We hope to see you at our 3 events in June, and the link to that schedule is also in the chat box. And another very exciting announcement: on June 1st, Broadway Books is going to unlock our front door for the first time in 15 months. So we're a little nervous about that, but we're very excited to feel like a real bookstore again. So please come see us. And many, many thanks to the 4 authors tonight. We just so appreciate you. You're all, as Kim said, humongously talented people. And we are honored to have you on our virtual stage. So good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Good
so
night.
much, Alex.
Thank you.
Congratulations, Alex.